What's up, my beautiful, positive, inspiring people? Thank you for being here. I appreciate you. I wanted to talk about something that's really, really important and is what I call progressive awakening. Because if you read a book like The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, he talks about going into a deep, shall we say, depression or sadness, seriously low vibratory state, and getting to the point where something kind of almost broke. Something broke, and all of a sudden, he tells the story of all of a sudden looking around the room and seeing things with fresh eyes, looking around the room and realizing that he didn't have this mental chatter over the top, that his mind was just really quiet. And he talks about being on park benches for a while afterwards, just taking in the scenery and watching people go by and barely having any thoughts in his mind at all, just completely enjoying this blissed out sense of being, just enjoying the joy of just being without this mental narrative over the top. And that was so intense for him that he almost didn't want to do anything. And it was after a while that the mind started coming back in and being like, what are you actually doing here? You probably need some money and things like that, that he then went out and started to become more of a normal person. And you hear similar stories from, say, the tales of great Indian sages like Sri Ramana Maharshi, who had an episode where he thought he was going to die and then had this sudden liberation, something broke again, going really, really deep down into a dark place, and then suddenly realizing a deep truth, suddenly realizing his true essential nature, essentially, as awareness, as opposed to all of the concepts and mind information that we so often just identify with and create this sense of self out of, that causes us so much suffering. So I wonder if a lot of people read those kinds of accounts from these great spiritual teachers, which there are many of, and they all share this similar theme of sudden awakening. I wonder if many people look at that kind of stuff and they think, well, that's not me, because that's not happened to me. Do I have to go to this really dark place to then suddenly be awakened? And for some people, maybe that's true. Some people, they're not going to give up the mind identification until it causes them so much suffering that they want to break free. And I think there is going to be an element of that in a lot of people's journey, not necessarily down to super, super deep, dark places that almost cause seizures in the mind that blast out the part responsible for creating the sense of self, and then, just entering this blissed out state of being. But having this progressive realization that suffering creates the urge to transcend it and enter a state of presence and awareness. Because not everybody's journey is like that. I myself, yes, went to some deep, dark places. And that is when a lot of things clicked. That's when a lot of these teachings clicked. And I started to really be able to recognize the difference between this full sense of self I created for myself in my head and me as awareness, me as being. Battery's saying it's low. So that's not what happened to me. It didn't it didn't just suddenly switch. There were realizations from the suffering, but there's been such a journey since. It wasn't like all of a sudden I realized from my deep, dark suffering what I'd got myself into, and then suddenly my mind stopped. No, it was more of a gradual process. Yes, I got that realization when I truly recognized the presence and the being within me that, hey, this is liberation. This is the path to transcending psychological suffering. But then, of course, the mind comes back in and we get addicted to it. We start following the stories again about past and future, about people and things that have happened, and sad stories or frustration stories or anger stories, and we get sucked back into that again. But once you have that awareness, that recognition of that presence and being in you, then you start to go into the mind identification, into the ego. You follow it for a certain period of time, and then it causes you the suffering again. And then that's what awakens you again. You step back out and you go, hang on a minute, I followed this story in my head about this and that, and it's just caused me a load of frustration and worry or anxiety. And then suddenly you wake back up. And every time you do that, you create more presence power within you, because this is the progressive path, as opposed to this sudden switch that happened with a lot of the spiritual teachers, a lot of the famous spiritual teachers. Both paths are just as powerful, but one is more in stages. One may more greatly apply to the wider population, who aren't necessarily right now going to have suffering so powerful that it suddenly awakens them. Maybe a lot of people are like me, who had deep, dark traumas, but then the awakening is more progressive. It's more a case of realizing you've been sucked back into ego and coming back out into presence. And every time you do that, every time you repeat that process, you create that presence power within you, like doing bicep curls at the gym. You create that strength and you're able to hold it in a particular position. You're able to hold yourself in the analogy, in presence. And you can see that gradual unfolding as you progress down this path. You can see that the times that you're present and in being gradually get longer and longer. And now for me, personally, it's like the mind identification just now comes in little bursts. It's like I suddenly think about something and I recognize the disparity between being in awareness and presence and the immediate heaviness or anxiety or emotional suffering that comes in this like micro form when you suddenly have one of these anxious thoughts, and then you're like, oh, okay, that's there, and then I've become identified with it, and now it's like immediately stepping out and I'm back into presence. So the time that I'm identified with the mental chatter has become shorter and shorter, and the time that I'm in presence and the being mode is getting longer and longer. So every time you get sucked back in to the mind stream, don't worry, because every time you realize that's happened and you step back out, you're going to increase the amount of time, you're going to increase the depth of presence within you, and it's going to lead to so much liberation from psychological suffering. Peace.